Still waiting for some people to join, unless Joel tells me to start.
Let's give it till 7:03.
Okay. Good evening.
I think we're good.
All right. Good evening, everyone. My name is Laszlo Jakaborcsos. I'm the head of the programming department at Brooklyn Public Library. Together with my team, we are producing now, feels like we are producing a TV channel. We are here pretty much every night producing different kind of events. In fact, 2 days ago, we had this riveting conversation with Naomi Klein, who wrote a climate change books for teenagers. And there were hundreds of teenagers talking to her. It was actually life-saving for many of us. It felt really amazing. And tonight we're moving on to another very important event to us. We all worked with Claudia Lomnitz and Claire Messud in the past, and we were really happy when they both said yes to talk about Claudia's newest book. Claudia Lomnitz is an anthropologist, a historian, and a writer, and probably this order could be changed and mixed. He has a really, really amazing mind. I had the honor to work with him a couple of years ago on a huge event. And you may have heard about his first big book on death and the idea of Mexico, which is the history of death and the kind of cultural history of death in Mexico. It's a fabulous book. And now he has this ambitious and rich and riveting book on his family. It's a history of intellect and relationships and love and perseverance and resilience. It's an amazing book. Nuestra America, this is the galley. Claire has the final edition here. That's the hardcover, and it's all available through our partner Greenlight Bookstore. We're going to be mentioning it in the chat. Claire Messud, to all of our delights, said yes to moderate this conversation. She's a fabulous writer herself, an essayist, and a creative writing teacher. You heard about her book, The Emperor's Children, which got great reviews. Since she churned out novels, she has 5, as far as I remember, 5 novels. And lately, last year, she published a really interesting book. It's a collection of essays. It's pretty much a intellectual memoir, how you see yourself through in the mirror of a collection of essays. The title is fantastic. I really love this title, Claire, Kant's Little Prussian Head and Other Reasons Why I Write. So if you haven't checked it out yet, please pick up a copy at the library or at the bookstore. And with this, Claudio, thank you so much. Congratulations to your new book. And Claire, thank you. And thanks so much.
Thank you, Claudio. Welcome. It's wonderful. It's such a great treat for me to be here with you. And congratulations on this extraordinary book. I'm going to hold up the beautiful cover. Which is you?
Well, on my left, I guess it's on your right, the one that isn't hugging, the one that's being hugged. The other one.
The one that's being hugged is you. Okay, so it's such an adorable photo. And for those of you, I don't know if you can see, it's the subtitle of the book is "My Family in the Vertigo of Translation," I'm desperate, Claudia, for you to read a little for us. I don't know if you might. Perhaps start, we spoke of a couple of readings, perhaps you might start with the first one and then we can open out the conversation from there, if that's okay with you.
Absolutely, gladly. And thank you, Claire, for this conversation. It means a lot to me. So this is a section from the introduction called America. My father knew a lot about geology, and according to his point of view, South America is an immature continent. The Andes were to him dizzyingly dramatic. Mother of stone, foam of condors, as Pablo Neruda put it. As a geophysicist, he did not find peace amidst such deep stirrings. When I was 4 years old, we took a trip to Peru. Among my memories of the journey is a stop in Arica, as well as a nauseating plane ride to Pisco. I preserve in my mind an image of the red callous desert of Atacama and of the Morro de Arica, where the site where the Peruvian Colonel Alfonso Ugarte threw himself into the abyss rather than surrender to the Chilean army. On the taking of the frigate El Huáscar in that same War of the Pacific of 1879, when the Chilean military beat Peru and Bolivia and appropriated their southernmost provinces. In those days, we boys played with lacquered lead soldiers, and as a proud Chilean, all of this fascinated me. I remember also an afternoon among the cliffs of the Antofagasta coast, walking with my brothers, looking for anemones and starfish. The sun-filled and freezing Pacific snorted up between the slender tongues of perforated rock. An octopus hid itself in the whirlpool. Later, in Lima's Chorrillos neighborhood, I read a plaque commemorating the struggle of the valiant Peruvian people, quote, against Chilean barbarism. I was 4 then and read rather slowly so that when I finally came to the part on the Chilean invaders, I cried out in disbelief, "Mommy, it says here, Chilean barbarians." We good-hearted Chileans were barbarians? In Lima, we also visited an archaeological dig. My grandfather Misha was there, though I don't recall how he got there or why. He knew the archaeologists, or at least he knew how to approach them because they allowed us to touch the cloth that covered some mummies that they were removing. I remember them giving him a strip of that ancient cloth, though I might be mistaken about that. This was my first contact with the magic of antiquity. The dryness of the Peruvian coastal desert can preserve cloth for hundreds and even thousands of years, and it was possible to touch that cloth, to interrogate it. My grandparents did not accompany us to Cusco or on the rest of the trip because of Misha's heart condition. There was once a photograph of my grandfather at that spot, but now I can't find it. I substituted with another of the self-same Misha, but young and in a different locale in Peru. He has in his lap a skull, as if he were Hamlet posing with a pre-Incan Yorick. To be or not to be indigenous, or better put, as the great Brazilian modernist Oswald Andrade would write at around that same time, Tupi or not Tupi? Was this perhaps the question my grandfather was asking? I doubt it. More likely, as the committed Jew and Marxist that he was at that time, he was inclined to see the present reflected in the mirror of Incan glory. Today's Indians, though subjugated, would once again become great. Though imperiled, the Jews were once again becoming great. This was the source of his energy and enthusiasm for Hebrew, as well as for his passion for the emancipatory spark that he intuited in indigenous communalism. My grandfather was not then a wavering prince like Hamlet. Rather, he was a man compelled to create a future out of a present that was always precarious, and from a past that was crumbling around him. For him, the idea of a new world was a necessity. His idea of America had less to do with nostalgia for the past than with a reality that needed to be achieved. Our America, the America of my family, was a necessary place that one must inhabit and defend.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I feel there's so much in that passage that I want to unpack and talk about with you. It makes me think, and that photograph of your grandfather makes me think of, and I think I mentioned this in an email of that line from W.J. Sebald's The Emigrants, from the first section where he writes, "They are always returning to us, the dead." And also it makes me think at the same time of Teju Cole's novel, Open City, this this sense of the sedimentation, that sort of layers that lie beneath the way that we can both touch the past, but also in another moment ignore it, walk right over it without even realizing or thinking about what we're doing. And I wondered, because the next paragraph, which you didn't read, is one in which you say, we're no longer governed by tradition, so we can't simply rely on a collective past. For this reason, family history is again relevant. And I wondered if you could talk a little about your decision to write this book, which is a big and complicated book, but also very personal book. Why now in this moment rather than 10 years ago, or waiting 10 years to do it in the future?
Well, I had, on one hand, I had kind of personal motivations that made it possible. As you know, one needs that. Otherwise, it's very hard to write. And I had it. I had anxiety about the situation of my kids, who I felt that I needed to understand a little bit more the decisions that had made me possible, because it's some, to some extent it's a memoir, but it ends, in my childhood, so it's not really about me.
It's a family memoir rather than a personal one. It's a family history.
Mm-hmm. And I think, I started off with a sense of a feeling like, well, how could I explain how was it possible that I had like a good childhood, that I had a happy childhood? How was that achieved? What kind of an achievement was that? What did it take? Because although I didn't know a lot of the history that I discovered in writing it, I knew enough to know that I had pretty much horrible stuff, in the background, not that far in the background. And so I kind of wanted to know how it was possible to generate a sort of an urge for life and for this worldly commitment, to not retire from the world. And that's part of this Our America. To me, Nuestra America involves an attitude of appropriation, which is an inworldly impulse. And I wanted to be sure that remains. It's not a Buddhist book. It's looking for inwardly how not to retire.
Well, in that sense, I mean, maybe you talk a little about your maternal grandparents, who were so passionately and in a lot of instances joyously, it seems, engaged with life, publishing magazines and politically active, and even when as you say, the circumstances, they were navigating an incredibly difficult world, in all sorts of ways.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's something also, there was something about this is my maternal grandparents, who occupy a good chunk of the book. They're maybe the most important characters there, although they're not the only ones. But there's something about the couple that I felt had something to teach me, because my grandfather, speaking of where you started with the layers, the layers in a city, my grandfather was like a rat pack a little bit. He was, committed to history. He had this whole thing with, he gained this whole thing with Native American cultures, societies that he became fascinated with, as well as with Hebrew, with Jewish history. Whereas my grandmother was absolutely anti-sentimental. I mean, ruthlessly anti-sentimental. and she, when my grandfather died, she threw out, she gave away, which, she was right, but she did that, and she wouldn't have been able to live with all this stuff. And I felt that there's something I couldn't I can never really sit on either end of that, of that dialectic. You know what I mean? Because I think that there was something in terms of loving life. There's something about that willingness to throw out, to forget that you had in my grandmother the anti-sentimentalism, and there's also something about my grandfather's, sort of impulse to preserve and create out of the past, and often out of a distant past.
So this is not an intellectual question. It's a simply practical one. But in order to research this, I mean, how much of there are wonderful photographs. How much of the other documentation was in the family, and how much did you actually have to go and find elsewhere?
I had to find a lot elsewhere, because unfortunately, since my family was a bunch of exiled, often multiple times, and I mean, not often, but sometimes multiple times. They didn't keep a lot, so there were very precious letters and things like that, but not as many as one would hope for, and also more dispersed in the family. Some of them arrived to me at the very end, when I was, I'd been writing this for years, and so sometimes the family has stuff that they don't realize they have, or that they don't realize matters. But one of the really exciting things about writing this book to me was that it was an impossible endeavor from the start. I'm an anthropologist, and I'm also trained as an historian, and and so, you have certain standards, especially historians have certain kinds of standards of specialization. And I couldn't meet those standards. I didn't have the languages I didn't have. So I had to make do. And the book is really a book that I very much wanted to write, but that has to constantly make do with what I had, make do with what I knew. And one of the results of that, I think, is that it's a book that's written with more friendship than others. I mean, all the books that I've written have some friendship in it, but this one really relied on them, because a lot of the research actually comes from, from friends who were located in some of these different places, in Colombia, in Peru, in Israel, in Germany, and who helped me a lot with a set of documents, and sometimes with translations. Mm-hmm.
It's wonderful. In that sense, I mean, this book is so humanly alive, and I know it's a work that involves a huge amount of scholarship and research, but what it feels that it's a book about the lives of people and the lives of their minds, and the life of your mind as well, in this very intimate and engaging way. And I think one of the things there's so many things, but one thing I wanted to ask you about, at the end of the passage that you read, you say of your grandfather, for him, the idea of a new world was a necessity, and part of that obviously was the situation in Europe at the time. So your grandfather was born almost with the century, or close, essentially, yeah, a little after the turn of the 20th century. But he actually emigrated well before. I mean, one of the things I find so fascinating about the family trajectories, because they are complicated, there's travel back to Europe and then back to Latin America. That obviously, in coming to the place of Nuestra America, of your family's America, there was some hesitation or uncertainty initially, or complication. It was not a smooth or unreflective wholesale move in the first instance.
Yes, I think too that what happens with these pasts, in terms of your earlier question about how to create them, sometimes what is happening is so bright, and that you need to really read carefully, read slowly, think about things very slowly. Like what you're saying now, I mean, a return to Europe, I mean, how's that? In part, the return transpires very shortly after they've been exiled from Peru, kicked out of Peru. And because my grandfather had come under the influence of, my grandparents both had come under the influence of Jose Carlos Mariátegui, this Peruvian luminary who was deeply committed to indigenous communalism. And my grandfather had a feeling about it, like a connection between indigenous communalism and his interest in Jewish emancipation. That they went to Paris, which was where my mother was born, to study. He studied there with Paul Rivet, who was a famous ethnologist who worked on Ecuador and South America, and then after finishing those studies, which was a couple of years, they went back to Nova Sulica, that is his hometown. And this is a risky thing that they did, because this was already 1934, and they stayed there for a couple of years. My grandfather was trying to get as many Jewish people out of there as possible, including his parents, which he failed to convince them, unfortunately. And in the end, they left pretty much at the last possible minute, in terms of, travel had already, by 36, 37, the travel had gotten very difficult. So they returned to Colombia at that point. So yes, there's a lot of tacking back and forth, and I think a lot of uncertainty. Part of the uncertainty has to do with emigration to Israel or to Palestine. I think that my grandfather initially would have wanted to go to Palestine rather than to Peru in the 20s, but immigration was closed at that time and he needed to get out because there was a draft. But then he becomes so committed to South America, they become so committed to South America, that when they do immigrate to Israel, which is 1949, right after the independence, they only stay for a couple of years and then they go back to Colombia. So you have part of that story. I don't know whether this is what they thought, because I unfortunately, my grandfather died when I was 13, so I didn't get a chance to talk to him about some things. I did talk to him a lot. But I sometimes have a horrible feeling like that immigration at a certain point becomes almost I don't know. I was going to say a way of life. I'm not sure if that's the case. That's not a good description. But there's something you can move at a certain point on a certain impulse. And I think that did happen to them for a while there. I think they were deeply dislocated at a certain level, and that's part of this commitment comes from that.
So many so many things arise for me in that. I mean, I think one is you speak you write so interestingly. About Judaism and the role in European cultures of the Jew as other, right? From very early on, and of course, maybe it's in a moment you might read a little about the Romanian situation, about Eliade and the Romanian situation. But it makes me, there were at various points part of this nomadic or peripatetic situation had to do also with nationalities and displacement, sometimes as a decision, but sometimes literally, because you're not holding the passport that you
Yes.
need, or which is, I mean, those are very different. To choose to move because you're embracing, a culture or a new experience is very different from realizing
Not having a nationality, which was what my mother had and my grandparents had for a while. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
And you have a number of nationalities, I believe.
Yeah, that's right. I do. I'm trying to cure. I'm trying to make up for it. Yeah. I mean, one thing that I discovered in writing the book really is a deeper kind of connection between this history of displacement, but also the kind of sort of small town cosmopolitanism that existed in certain Eastern European and Central European contexts, Jewish enclaves in those areas. And vanguardism and the rethinking of Latin America and of South America, because this book to a large degree is about sort of the South American effervescence, cultural effervescence of the 20th century, especially the first, let's say, 2/3 of the 20th century, from the 20s to the 60s, 70s. And that effervescence is usually told in Latin America in nationalist terms, sort of internal to it. Even the term Nuestra America, in Spanish, that title is associated with José Martí's essay, Nuestra America, which was written, don't remember the day, but let's say 1880 or so. And there's the idea in that Nuestra America of an America that is based on kind of racial fusion. That idea then emerges more strongly in Mexico, the Mexican Revolution, but was also important in Peru and in the Mariátegui circle in the 20s. Which fascinated my grandparents, because they came from such a deeply racialized, discriminatory situation in Eastern Europe and in Romania and in Russia. But I discovered that there's a lot of there's not only a deep kind of elective affinity between the let's say the ferment of Jewish culture of the beginning of the 20th century and vanguardism in Latin America in the 1920s and 30s. There is an elective affinity, but there was also, in the case of my own family story, not just an elective affinity, but an actual association, and so actual collaboration. So there's in some way something about this South American story that allows for the realization and critique of Jewish culture from South America, and also the rethinking of South America to some extent, I think, passed through the thinkers of the Jewish thinkers that were emerging that had emerged in Europe, and some of which lived in the Americas.
Yes, so I'm curious, because now which relative is was it a grandmother who was the fifth Jewish person buried in the Jewish cemetery,
right,
in
Medellin?
Yes, in Medellin. So which implies that it was a new community at that point. I mean, that's about that's Colombia rather than Peru, but
Peru, it was even more so. These were very minoritarian experiences. There were only maybe 2,000 Jews in Peru in the 1920s, and the first ones arrived. There were like 20 of them in 1895. I mean, there really were no Jews before then, except the Marrano, that sort of crypto Jewish immigration during the Spanish colonial period, which was erased from memory. So in terms of people who identified as Jews, it's a very recent thing. And in Colombia, the community wasn't much bigger either. Maybe there were 4,000. Since my grandparents in Colombia lived in rural area, I mean, not rural, but provincial, they were often, the only Jewish family. So this is Jewish experiences that are very deeply minoritarian. A little bit like the Jews here in the U.S. that settled in the South or something like that.
Right. I have a friend from Memphis who as that I think on one side of his family, there were originally 5 Jewish families in Memphis, and on one side of the family, can trace back to one of the five families, you know. So yes, but it's a very particular, it's a very particular history. And it's interesting to me that it's that in the 20s and 30s, when in the wider world, and it actually happens in Colombia, that I guess Jewish immigration is stopped in the 30s, right?
Right after Kristallnacht, they stop it completely, and even before that. And this is not a peculiarly Colombian thing. The openness to immigration once the Nazi effort against it was strong, was not so large. Even in a country like Mexico, which one associates with having received more of a Jewish immigration during the, as a result of the Nazi period, because Cárdenas, who was president in the 30s, was deeply anti-fascist. The numbers are actually low because he tended to favor only like political immigrants rather than, let's say, racial or ethnic immigrants. So the Jews that came to Mexico in the 30s were mostly communists, and people who had actively fought against fascism rather than simply refugees. So there wasn't very much openness, with a few exceptions. Bolivia was.
So maybe actually, would you read us another perhaps another section? I was thinking of the Iphigenia in Bucharest.
Sure,
section,
gladly.
Which will give some perhaps a little context for because I'm not sure that we've made explicit, but your grandparents hailed from, or certainly your grandfather hailed from what is now Romania.
What is the town that he came from is now in the Ukraine, but when he left for Peru, it was part of Romania.
Right, it was part of Romania.
And during the Holocaust, it was part of Romania. So this section is called Iphigenia in Bucharest. Eliade, I'm talking here about Mircea Eliade, wrote his first drama in the autumn of 1939, and it was performed in the National Theatre of Bucharest in the beginning of 1941, just before the Romanian invasion of the Soviet Union. It was a version of Euripides' Iphigenia in Aulis, and so it dealt with sacrifice. In the Iphigenia of Euripides, Agamemnon has offended the goddess Artemis, who vents her spleen by preventing the Achaean fleet from leaving port. The wind doesn't blow, and the Greek ships can't sail. The Achaeans consult the seer Calchas, who suggests that Agamemnon must sacrifice his daughter Iphigenia in order to placate Artemis. In the end, Iphigenia volunteers to be sacrificed, as he prefers to be remembered as a national heroine than to marry and live a long life at the expense of the Achaean people. Eliade would make use of this legend to write a play dedicated to the sacrifice of Ion Motza and Vasile Marin, two Iron Guard militants who decided to go to Spain to fight on the side of fascism during that country's 3-year civil war. They both died on the same day in 1937, fighting to capture Madrid. Motza and Marin's bodies were repatriated and paraded by train from town to town on their way to a mass funeral in Bucharest. Crowds gathered at each stop, with the people crying in unison that they would gladly sacrifice themselves for the fatherland to avenge their fallen countrymen. That same year, in the same year as Motza and Marin's funeral, Eliade found himself stripped of his professorship at the University of Bucharest because of his activities in the Iron Guard, which was a clandestine organization. That Iron Guard is a fascist party. A year later, he was arrested as part of a government crackdown on the far right that charged him with authoring Iron Guard propaganda. During this tense period, Eliade wrote newspaper articles glorifying Motza and Marin and praising the Iron Guard's founders. When he was released from jail in November 1938, he immediately set to work on Iphigenia. Eliade's work confirms Ionesco's complaint. For a fascist, the state is concrete, while human beings are immaterial. To Eliade, a mythical character from antiquity like Iphigenia was transcendent, and the martyrs Mozza and Marin were transcendent. But the flesh and blood humans who were to be sent to die in war in order to follow such immortal sacrifices mattered little. What really mattered was the immortality of their gesture, and not the fact that invading the Soviet Union implied sending the Romanian army off to slaughter. Eliade was also fond of another story that he believed offered a key to understanding the true Romanian essence, the legend of Master Manole. It tells of the construction of a great cathedral, a process that ultimately requires the pious master builder, Manole, through a dream vision, to bury his pregnant wife alive in the building's foundation. The story is, in essence, a Christian version of the tale of Iphigenia, the willing sacrifice of what one holds dearest for a higher ideal. Through all their fixation on sacrificial ecstasy, Romanian fascists never stopped to consider that the Jews perhaps might also form a part of their community, if given a chance. To them, the mass murder of Jews was an act of common prophylaxis. The death of two imbecilic heroes who went to Spain voluntarily to fight for Franco moved the country to tears, but the cowardly murder of 100 or even hundreds of thousands of Jews meant nothing except the purification of the nation. On the other hand, as the alleged source of all evils undermining the national community, Jews stabilized the fascists' worldview, so anti-Semites might have felt some ambivalence about losing the Jews altogether. Their total absence might leave the surviving community with a melancholy feeling of having annihilated a people while still nursing the social ills for which they had been blamed. Maybe some of these fascists thought that they might bring the Jews back if they ever felt a need for them. If they did secretly hold such hopes, they were disappointed. Today in Romania, there's only their stark absence. Years after the war, Eliade published a strategically redacted edition of his diaries, where he offered effusive praise for Mikhail Sebastian, exclaiming, "How I empathized with his immense efforts and with all the suffering that came with each page. I will never forgive myself for not going back to see him in August 1942 when I returned to Bucharest for a week. I was ashamed of myself at that point. I was a cultural attaché in Lisbon, while he had suffered numerous humiliations for having been born and for wishing to remain Joseph Hector. I now agonize over this in vain, as it is too late." Joseph Hector had taken on the pen name Mikhail Sebastian and insisted in his writing that there was such a thing as a Romanian Jew, that it was possible to be both Jewish and Romanian. With the publication of these lines about Sebastian having been humiliated for wishing publicly to remain Jewish, Eliade revealed himself to be a rascal and a con artist. The affection and admiration that he had for Sebastian were genuine. The two were very close friends. But Eliade was personally responsible for at least a few of the humiliations suffered by Sebastian for quote, wishing to remain Joseph Hector. And as an ideologue of the rabidly anti-Semitic Iron Guard, Eliade could hardly expect Sebastian to have had an easy time, quote, remaining Joseph Hector. Eliade mentions his shame for not having visited Sebastian in 1942, supposedly provoked by the privileges that he knew he enjoyed as a cultural attaché in fascist Portugal, while Sebastian was humiliating for, quote, wishing to be Jewish in Bucharest. But Sebastian was not being persecuted for wishing to remain a Jew. He had been raised Jewish, rather, whether he liked it or not, and everyone knew that he was Jewish. Meanwhile, in all his pathetic self-recrimination, Eliade somehow fails to mention that anti-Semitism was part of the very foundation of the Iron Guard, to which he himself had been so committed. Maybe I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. If you were to read on, you would actually be reading about Ionesco's, the playwright Eugene Ionesco's play Rhinoceros and his, and I'm just, because I think, would you read just a tiny, is that okay?
Yes, yes, absolutely. In his discussion of the origin of his image of the rhinoceros, UNESCO clearly identified the pivotal role that anti-Semitism had for Romania's fascists. I quote, "I have witnessed transformations of people into rhinoceroses. I've seen people change almost before my very eyes. There's the example of I. He was part of our group. We were young then, so how could we intellectually resist all the specialists who had converted into fanatics? Sociologists, cultural philosophers, biologists had found scientific reasons to justify racism, writers, journalists. One day I showed up, and told us that we were right, of course, and that the rest were without a doubt monstrous or stupid. Nevertheless, he said, it's strange that at times, they seem to be right on a particular point. One point out of 10,000, such as, for example, they say that the Jew, at that moment, we all realized that I has already been trapped by the machine. I gave them between 4 and 6 weeks before they succumbed definitively giving in to the temptation of power. Anti-Semitism was in fact the original feature of the rhinoceros. Sebastian, for his part, was an unusual witness to the Jewish genocide in Romania because he knew it from its gestational period in the 1930s, since he worked and lived alongside the creme de la creme of Bucharest intellectuals. So many of them were leaders of the Iron Guard. Sebastian also witnessed how his old friend Mircea Eliade wrote articles from his post as attaché in Portugal as a kind of Nero playing the lyre while his fascist panegyrics, while the Red Army destroyed the Romanian army at the Battle of Stalingrad. After the war, Eliade covered up his role in the elimination of the Jewish population of Romania, but he and his companions in fact accomplished their mission, as Jews are now largely absent in that country.
Thank you very much. I just want to interject for 1 second to say that soon we'll move over to Q&A. So if you have questions, please do put them in the chat so that we can, so that Claudio can answer your questions. But before we do that, I think I know I asked you to read on a little, but I think the case of Eliade seems so significant in terms of our contemporary moment. And one of the things that we haven't yet got to is I wrote to you and I said, one of the things that I feel so powerfully is that you and I were raised, as it were, we're our grandparents' grandchildren, right? We're also our parents' children, but we're our grandparents' grandchildren, and that there was a, I just, you said, I'm not being very articulate. Cosmopolitanism, internationalism, hybridity, the polyglot world. I mean, one of the things you talk about is all the languages that your grandfather was able to speak. A sort of a vision of the world that involved all of those things is something. And yet did not involve being homeless, right? I mean, that's a complicated balance, but I think that's something that certainly our grandparents would have advocated, and that our parents in a post-war time felt a responsibility also to work for, all the more so because of the tragedy of the war, and yet here we are again. Not so many years later, in a time of nationalisms and tribalism and borders and the raising of borders and the othering of people. And I wondered
and of the rhinoceros. I don't know whether you
exactly. Yes, yeah. Of the rhinoceros and I mean the rhinoceros all around us in this country right here. And I thought maybe you have some thoughts about that.
I mean, I do. I think that it's a scary time, and right now that here in the U.S. we seem to have been granted some respite, and given because I come from South America, I was and that provides me with a certain paranoid streak, put it that way. is to, I was fearful of a coup from from quite early on with this business, um, uh, and here in the U.S., where my friends here in the U.S. didn't think it was possible, and they were probably right, but I think it came pretty close and seemed to have dodged the bullet this time around. I think it's not too late to kind of rally a little bit and rethink some of the kind of both the question of nationalism, also the question of identity, and of I think that, to my mind, some of the rejection of universalism has been a bit radical. That is, here in the U.S. Has been a bit radical. I say radical in not in the good sense, a bit extreme. That is okay. Certainly, the Enlightenment is as a process. Enlightenment as a process still requires, and definitely required some kind of a critique from the margins, or a critique from labor, from the workers, from the people who suffered most from the development of the capitalism that underlay the development, or made possible Enlightenment as a universalizing project. That's one thing, and another thing is to leave no room for anything but the resurgence of nationalism, or to leave not little room for anything but nationalism. And I'm seeing that certainly in the US, but we see that all over the world, and in Latin America too, including Mexico. It's very disturbing to me. And that's why, one of the reasons why I did choose to write a little bit about Eliade, because I think that intellectual responsibility is something that needs to be talked about.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And as you say, I mean, we seem to be in a time of respite, but all around the world, right? This is a global phenomenon. And I read something recently, and then I will start asking the questions that people are posing in the chat. But that Marine Le Pen is essentially Macron's chief contender, or will be in the next election. You have this sense everywhere that there's, can we keep things in abeyance for long enough to try to affect some change in attitudes? Mm-hmm. Certainly, I also know in France that I believe a lot of the former working left wing is now nationalist right wing. So that's a whole other conversation for another day. But what that movement, how that movement has come about from the left to the right, and why nationalisms and tribalisms are the where once it was communism, where once it was internationalism. Now there's a move in the other, so powerfully in the other direction. If you might, and I don't know if you would like to say something about that, and then I will ask. I'm sorry, everybody, I've been slow, but I'll ask the questions that people have put in the chat.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think that it's very, once you have movements, of working classes and lower middle classes to the right, you're in trouble, and we know enough of history to know that. And I think we are kind of in trouble, and something needs to be. This needs to be addressed. I don't know if I'm not very good at foreseeing anything, so I look to the past in order to try to figure out what to do now. But there's no prescription in this book. It's more a space that allows, I think, for some opening up and some reflection, and specifically some of the opening up that I do think would be interesting to think about now in the U.S. is an opening up southward to Latin America, because there was a time, and now that his name just I just forgot now that his name, the beat poet who just died in San Francisco.
And yes, and Ferlinghetti.
Ferlinghetti, yeah. So now that beat generation that's right now on our minds because of his passing, that they went to Mexico, and they weren't the only ones who went to Mexico. Before that, you had the Steinbeck, and you had all the Hollywood people, and the hippies and all that. They went there. There was the possibility of generating some kind of counterculture in that movement, and I think that movement also really affected Mexico positively. I mean, that I'm sure not everybody in Mexico would agree with me, but I feel that way definitely. In Mexico, when my family arrived to Mexico in 1968, and we had lived in California for a couple of years. My elder brother, who died unfortunately many years ago, but he's the one who's in that picture in the cover. Jorge, he had long hair. He was beat up on the street in Mexico City. I mean, it was a very conservative environment and a quite authoritarian regime. So this kind of movement with the U.S., conflicting and problematic though it was I think beneficial to both sides, and wouldn't be bad for people in the U.S. right now to find some ways to move to circulate a little bit more southward, and to have the South circulate a little bit more here. And when I say the South here, I'm talking about Latin America specifically, because I do think that there's an American, in the sense of the continent, set of possibilities that have been explored in one way or another by different kinds of people, and we kind of need them right now.
Yeah. I mean, that again, we need another hour to, because I certainly, I think that question of the kinship and yet differences between North America and South America, so interesting. But perhaps I should pose you a question that we have from Cynthia Molina, who asks, what does it mean for you to be a Latin American Jew? And says, here in the USA, I ask this question to myself every day.
I mean, to me, I think one of the things it means is that the term Latin American, to me, has content, which it doesn't always have for Latin Americans. It has content because there are only 2 or 3 groups of people that moved around those spaces. And one of them were Jews. The other ones were people from the Ottoman Empire, either Christians, Lebanese, Syrian Christians, or Muslims, who arrived at the beginning of the 20th century, around the First World War, usually. Those are the only people who have biographies that are like, I was born in Chile, I was raised in Mexico, I had family in Caracas, family in Colombia. I can't claim to be Latin American, but it's close. It means something, Latin America. For Latin Americans, I think that the US is one of the spaces where Latin America begins to mean something, because over, even categories, these categories that are American categories like Latino or Latinx now, or Hispanic, they don't mean anything outside of the US. So this is also, this migratory spaces are spaces where the possibility of Latin America really emerges. And of course, intellectuals had that possibility in Latin America because they were interconnected between the capitals. They wrote, they corresponded, they read each other's journals. There's a dense Latin Americanism in the intelligentsia, but there isn't a popular Latin Americanism, and there wasn't. But now there's increasingly so because of these tremendous migrations. And I think in that sense, Jewish Jewish experiences provide a space from which you can reflect on that. You don't have to reflect on that. There's nothing that compels you to reflect on that, but it does give you that possibility. And I think, if you have that history, it's worth taking that. It's worth seizing that possibility.
Thank you. And another audience member, Thomas, asks if you could explain vanguardism.
Yeah, I mean, these there's several things that are happening. This is mostly the 1920s, so it's a period on the one hand where you have you have the air, you're sort of heir of a broken Belle Epoque, so that you have a period from the 1870s to the First World War, which is a long period of peace in Europe. No big wars, not entirely peaceful, and there's of course colonial wars, but in Europe it's relatively peaceful. So this is this period, but it's also, there's an arms race, right, between the French and the Germans and British, and so there's militarism, there's rising nationalism, but there's also this faith in progress, and that faith in progress breaks down with the First World War. Not just faith in progress, but faith in Western rationality, in the racial sort of kind of manifest destiny of whiteness, which I think starts meaning something in that period. I don't think before that exactly meant anything very clear. Europeanness. So you have the breakdown of all that rationality with the First World War, but also the rise of the Russian Revolution, right, in 1917. That's part of the context of the First World War. And that Russian Revolution, together with the breakdown of Western rationality, allows for an idea that you can claim, you can try to get as advanced as possible without going through all of the evolutionary steps. You don't have to be England, or you don't have to be Germany or France, the most advanced capitalist countries, or the US, the most advanced capitalist countries in the period, to be able to really reach for what it was most advanced. And of course, what was most advanced was communism, right? And a socialism, and also to some extent the arts and sciences of the most advanced part of the world. So vanguardism usually involved thinking that a small group that was at the lead could then take the society with it. Like the Bolsheviks are an example of vanguardists. A small group that took the state, and from the state they tried to revolutionize Russia, which was a very backward society. Vanguardism in Latin America has a little of that element. There's an intelligentsia in cities like Lima or Sao Paulo, Mexico City, that want to transform or revolutionize their societies from a small group that tries to either gain power directly, gain control of the state when you have a revolution, but when you don't, like you didn't in Peru, then you have the vanguardism as a literary movement, as an intellectual movement.
Thank you. So Joel asks, would you be able to talk a little more about how you researched and reported the book? Now, you mentioned earlier that your friends, that friends helped, but perhaps you could expand.
Yeah, I mean, it was very hard work for me because I really had to move outside of my comfort zone. My publications as an academic have been principally on Mexico, Mexican history, Mexican anthropology, and Latin America. But the Latin American part of it wasn't necessarily so deep. So even the Peruvian portion of the history, or the Colombian proportion of the history, were demanding to me. I needed to do more research, and there's, to say nothing about Jewish history, which I really knew very little about. Russian history, Romania, Israel at a certain point, so the US. So the movement of the family made the research very demanding for me, and it forced me to move out of the places where I could claim any kind of real expertise. Once in a while, I have some of that expertise. I hope it shows, but often I don't, and I had to sort of work to make up for that. Then there's a combination of work with memory, work with documents from the family. When there is no document, it meant trying to find sources, let's say, descriptions of what my grandfather's town, Novasulica, there's a book in Yiddish that was published by someone in his generation in Israel in 1965. I was able to find a Yiddish speaker who could summarize the book for me and then translate the passages that I thought were most useful. It's a book that benefited, and since we're doing this in the Brooklyn Library, it's a book that benefited and relied deeply on the wonders of the American library system. It could not have been written without that, for sure. But in addition to that, there's documentary research and sometimes documentary research to get specific kinds of things, let's say from Germany, from my German part of the history, or from Peru, or from Colombia. It's not an obsessively historian's book. It's really not. But there is a fair amount of research in it.
Thank you. And perhaps this will be our last question, maybe. This is from Julie Skursky. The recent show at the Whitney Museum on the impact of Mexican muralists on US art redefined the directionality of influence within a context of radical politics. In Venezuela, some of the most noted contemporary artists came from Eastern Europe. Many were Jewish. Can you comment on the openings provided within the artistic political realm in Latin America for rethinking aesthetic political possibilities?
Thank you, and thanks, Julie. It's great to hear from you. Yes, I mean, first of all, I was able to see that show in the Whitney right before the COVID, so I actually was able to see it, and it's an amazing show, by the way. And I'm usually kind of fed up with seeing muralists because I grew up in Mexico and all that, and they became part of the orthodoxy. I have to say, it was beautiful, and there's stuff in there that I had never seen. For example, Jackson Pollock's. I didn't realize that Jackson Pollock had been inspired by and worked with Jose Clemente Orozco, and they have some early Jackson Pollocks that are definitely, you see the connection with Orozco, and at the same time you very much see the Jackson Pollock. So it's fascinating. It's if you haven't seen it, it's definitely worth seeing that show and looking at some of the deep interconnections between Mexican modernism and American art. So in that way, I thought it was an exemplary show, and it was a kind of thing that exactly helps break down some of the nationalist ways of telling art history that sometimes dominate both in the U.S. and in Mexico. In Mexico, nationalism is a very big thing. It's had a kind of, it's one of these countries that it's like, it lost a couple of wars. It lost its, but it lost its big war with the U.S. and lost all this territory. So it has a defensive nationalism, and that sometimes leads to obsessively nationalistic telling of stories like the flourishing of Mexican modernism. And so this show, I thought, was really beautiful. And you're right, Julie, that there is, I haven't really thought this through, but just thinking out loud now, of course, there were a number of important artists who were Jewish or who had, or who were from Europe and who were in circles with a significant Jewish presence. I haven't studied this, but my impulse, let's say, to begin to answer the question, or how I would try to look at it, is that I think that the American spaces, the painters and all that developed in Brazil at this time, right? Or in Buenos Aires, or in Mexico City, Caracas. Were to some extent discovering, to some extent inventing, or participating in the excitement of the invention of some kind of tropicalism, that is some kind of modernist, alternative modernism, that broke with the prejudices of climate tradition that had dominated racism around Latin America, into the early 20th century, so that all of a sudden the exuberance of these places could foster a kind of space. I'm remembering something that Agnes Heller, the Hungarian philosopher, once mentioned to me years ago, which was that in Latin America there was a little bit more of a socially something, a little bit more of a rainforest. I can't remember how she put it, but I think that the point really was that there is a kind of like a canopy. There's enough chaos. There's enough diversity. There's enough disorganization to some extent to foster certain kind of space for creation, creativity, and also for the surrealistic sensibility that so many of that generation, not particularly Jewish, but of that generation had, right? Which comes from a sense that European rationality does, no matter how much you miss it, right? They, not me, but they who were, might have missed this or that from Europe, that European rationality just was not entirely a way out. So there's a way in which this becomes, this America, this South America, Latin America becomes, I think, a kind of elective country, homeland almost for surrealism.
Thank you so much. And I think we may have to call it a night at this point. I think Joel has maybe some things to say, but I just want to say thank you, Claudio. Thank you so much.
Thank you, truly.
Yeah, I'm going to echo that, Claudio. Thank you so much. Thank you, Claire. What an amazing conversation you both had. I could have taken notes. It was beautiful. The book is called Nuestra America, and you'll find a link to check out the book from our friends at Greenlight in the chat there. My colleague will post it in there. But thank you so much, Claire and Claudio, for this amazing conversation. It's clearly something that we all need to read, and I look forward to delving into it. What an amazing work of love and research. For those of you who are new to our series, please follow us on our social media at BPL Presents. And we're going to be back next week with an amazing couple of events, which Suleika Jouad is going to be in conversation with Mitchell Jackson on Monday. And then Tuesday, we're actually screening the film The Mauritanian, which has people involved with it who are close to our department, and we can't recommend it enough. It's a gorgeous film with Jodie Foster. And we hope you'll check that out too, all on BPL Presents. Claire, Claudio, thanks so much. Claudio, congratulations on this book. It was nice to hear you both.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all for coming.
Bye.